In this last segment on imperialism, we're going to head a little bit further east into Asia. We spent the last couple of talks looking at European imperialism in Africa, European imperialism in India, and today we're going to finish up with the European experience in China and Japan. As has been the case with many of these other places, there's going to be some unique characteristics to each of these encounters between Europeans and the local people. Remember, all of this, though, is being motivated by those same fundamental characteristics of increasing European political power, increasing European access to raw materials to help continue to grow industrially. And there's still this sense of Europeans being motivated by this feeling of social Darwinism, this sense of the white man's burden, that it is now their job to go out into the world and civilize the uncivilized places. And if you remember what we've learned previously about China, this is an incredible role reversal. From the Middle Ages and the Renaissance up to the Age of Exploration, China's been the destination. It's been the spot more than any other place, except maybe India, that Europeans were desperate to get to, were absolutely enamored with and fascinated by. Just couldn't believe all the amazing things that the Chinese had and knew and did. And now they're going there with a sense of cultural superiority and a feeling of, we need to upgrade these poor savages. It's an incredible shift historically, that for the first time pretty much in world history, China will not be the dominant power in the world. And other than a few run-ins with the Mongols, China's not used to this either. And so that's going to be one of the things that we see as we look into this story, is that China's not ready for this. The Europeans are surprised at their own strength, and the Chinese are surprised at their lack of strength. So let's dive in. As we were just talking about, the British, the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, everybody in Europe had been trying to get to China. I mean, that was the motivation behind Columbus's voyage, right? A westward route to China. And yet throughout the hundreds of years that Europeans had been attempting to trade with China, they kept facing one insurmountable obstacle, and it was namely that Europeans had nothing that the Chinese wanted. Not a thing, other than silver. Other than silver and perhaps gold, there was not a single trade good in the European economy that China wanted. China really had the best that the world had to offer through their own trade connections along the Silk Road and through their own means of production. And so for a couple of hundred years, the Europeans had been absolutely defeated in their attempts to find something to trade with. Anytime they wanted Chinese goods, they had to buy it. Money for product. They could never find a European product that they could just exchange and be able to save their money. That's all about to change. In the 1800s, the British stumble upon not the best option, but something finally that Chinese people were willing to exchange goods for. It was opium, an addictive narcotic that the British, who now control India, were able to grow in the northern regions of India and then sneak across the border, smuggle the drugs into China, and get millions of especially lower class Chinese people addicted to this drug. And then once addicted, those people were willing to hand over any and all trade goods they could get their hand on, just like any addict might, in exchange for more. And as you can imagine, the British are overjoyed, and the Chinese are livid and furious with this illegal drug trade happening in their country. And so long story short, there's some back and forth that happens here. The British protest their innocence. No, we'd never smuggle drugs. We wouldn't dream of doing such a thing. The Chinese threaten violence, both diplomatic and military. And eventually shots are fired. And it's at this point that China realizes how far they've fallen. And it's at this point that the British, I think, finally realized for the first time how strong Europe has become thanks to the Industrial Revolution. If you look in the picture on the bottom left, these are the infamous Chinese treasure junks that Zheng He used on his voyage around the Indian Ocean. These massive ships that were a marvel of engineering back in the 14 and 1500s that are now being pulverized by British gunboats. And the Chinese don't know what hit them. And at the end of this short-lived Opium War, the Chinese are forced to sign one of the most humiliating treaties they've ever had to sign in their history, the Treaty of Nanjing. And amongst other things, it gives the British total control of one of the most prosperous and profitable cities in China, the city of Hong Kong. And the British will get to keep that for about 150 years. The other thing that it does is it gives the British something called extraterritorial rights, meaning that British people in China are not necessarily subject to Chinese laws. They're subject to British laws. It's a little bit like diplomatic immunity, if you're familiar with that. But the short version of it is that the British are now a little bit untouchable in China. They can't necessarily be pulled into Chinese courts. They can't necessarily be prosecuted by the Chinese government. So they really have a lot of freedom here now to do whatever they please with China. And as you can imagine, the Chinese people are not happy with this turn of events. 4,000 years of cultural superiority now blown to smithereens in an instant. How are they going to respond? What are they going to do to try to get back on top? Well, the first thing that they attempt, and this will be a few years after the Opium War, the Chinese people actually rebel against their own government, sort of in frustration and outrage and disbelief that their government could have allowed this to happen. You're going to see rebellion led by peasants. You see the leader there on the left in the picture, a man by the name of Hong Xiaochuan, who was a peasant. He was a Christian convert in China, which makes him even a little bit more out of the ordinary for China. He leads this rebellion of a few million lower-class Chinese people against their own government. The government then has to try to crack down on this rebellion and maintain control while at the same time dealing with these, European encroachments, because, the rest of Europe was paying attention. And when the British brought out their gunships and, were able to win so easily, Germany, France, even Russia, and China's own neighbor Japan are like, we could do that too. And so over the next few years, China gets invaded by all these other opportunistic countries who sense weakness and sense a great economic opportunity. And so the Chinese government, internal rebellion, external invasions and pressures, it's more than they can handle. But somehow the government hangs on. And so over the course of this Taiping rebellion, it was hard to get a confirmed count because so many of these were lower class people, and but somewhere between 20 and 70 million Chinese are dead as a result of this rebellion, many from starvation, because when the lower class in China rebels, that means they're leaving their farms, which means the farms are not producing, which means there's not as much food. So this really is a catastrophe on top of the catastrophe of the Opium War for China. And it just makes China weaker. The Chinese government is forced to agree with these external invaders, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, and offer what they call spheres of influence. And you can see on the map on the right the sections that are carved out by these different European powers. So in the orange, the British, they grab a large chunk right next to their border with India just for convenience sake. Plus a coastal stretch that follows a river all the way inland, and so they're able to control trade all the way up and down that river. The French and Germans will come and do similar things. The French in the south, the Germans in the north, Remember, too, that this little city of Hong Kong, even though it's surrounded by a French sphere of influence, is going to be entirely British in ownership. And then, as was mentioned, even the Japanese will come over. They're just off the map over here and claim sections of China just north of Korea, and then even down here along the coast. So things are not looking good for China. They're looking great for the European imperialists, but they're not looking good for China. And so the question will continue to be, how will China respond? Because you know they're not happy with this situation. What will happen next is another rebellion, this time a rebellion against the Europeans directly. Again, this will be led by the lower class in China, this time urban laborers, workers. And so in the city of Beijing, these lower class laborers, workers, dock workers, factory workers are going to unite. And just as with today, there are social clubs that exist in society, places for people to get together after work hours, hang out, gossip, talk about the news and the weather and whatever else. And they have fun little names. The Elks Lodge, the Moose Club. Veterans of wars will get together at the VFW or things like that. And so in China, they had this society called the Society of the Harmonious Fist. And that was just the name of this group. The Europeans, being a little bit ethnocentric, figured that because all Asians are martial artists, that this must be, a bunch of kung fu experts getting together outside of work. And so they called them boxers, people that would fight with their hands. And so the short version of this story is that the boxers rebel against the British, the Germans, the French, this collection of Europeans that are dominating their country. And these boxers take a page out of Chinese mysticism and become convinced of this belief that because of their loyalty to China, because of their conviction and their desire to see China free and independent once more, that the spirits of their ancestors will actually protect them from the Europeans' bullets and machine guns and things like that. And so on the day of the rebellion, the boxers flood Beijing, attacking the embassies and the barracks of the European soldiers with the firm conviction that they will be kept safe because of these spiritual powers that are watching over them. And the crazy thing is that it works. The boxers seize the city. The Europeans are flushed out. The Europeans are trying to figure out how all of this happened and why they're losing. And the boxers are overjoyed that this seems to be successful. And then, unfortunately, a few days later, all of the European military might in China joins forces. They cross their cultural lines, Germans and French and Austrians and everybody, and they come together. They form this multinational coalition, and they pretty much annihilate the boxers. And so once again, the Chinese people are defeated. They feel humiliated. The Europeans have once again strengthened their hold on China. And China continues to have these moments of rebellion over the next series of years. Heading into the First World War, they'll then be invaded and taken over by Japan, who will kind of continue this imperial theme. And so it won't be until the end of World War II that China will actually get its independence back. Now, in contrast, when we look at Japan, Japan follows a completely different tactic when faced with the same threat. Early 1900s, the United States shows up. The United States didn't really get into China, despite their best attempts to. And so the United States looked next door at Japan and figured here maybe is an adversary that we could control, that we could be stronger than. And so President Millard Fillmore sends Commodore Matthew Perry with a small fleet of gunships. And he sends them into the harbor in Japan with a beautiful wooden box with a very nicely worded letter from the president. And the letter from President Fillmore says something along the lines of the United States would really enjoy trading and creating a trade relationship with Japan. We really hope you'll say yes. XOXO, President Fillmore. P.S. Look out your window at our really big battleships. We really hope you'll say yes. And so Japan is again faced with the same issue that China was: overwhelming military force. China seemed fairly convinced that they could win. Japan recognizes that they can't. And so instead of fighting a battle that they know they'll lose, Japan gives in and gives the United States permission to enter and begin trading. And then Japan does something that China, for whatever reason, wasn't willing to or wasn't able to do. Japan takes a page out of the European playbook and begins to quietly industrialize. The newly appointed Japanese emperor, who's just a young kid at this point, 15, sends out advisors to Europe, almost like Peter the Great did with Russia and his grand embassy. They go out and explore how Western Europe is doing all this. How are they industrializing? How are they running their economy and their military and their schools and their government? And they bring back all the best pieces of it, and they begin to reform, modernize Japan. And so slowly, over a few years, Japan's economy begins to be more industrially focused. They acquire the inventions of the steam engine and the railroad and the process of refining steel. They begin laying railroad track. They begin building battleships. They begin building factories. They begin building machine guns. And so kind of without anybody noticing it, Japan's getting stronger from the inside while still engaging with trade with Europeans, until the day comes that the Japanese have gotten strong enough that they kind of bounce all the Europeans out. And when the Europeans in the United States kind of look around and be like, who do you think you are? We can still beat you, blah, blah, blah. The Japanese roll out their new modernized navy, and they march out their new modernized army. And the United States and the Europeans have this moment of, oh, all right, well, I guess this isn't going to work anymore. And then Japan takes another page out of the European imperialism playbook. And this is when they begin their takeover of Korea, of China, of portions of Southeast Russia. They fight war after war with these unsuspecting adversaries who just didn't realize Japan had gotten so powerful. This political cartoon at the bottom is a great analogy or great imagery for this idea. Big bad China, who had always been kind of the big brother amongst the Asian countries, has now been downed by their little brother, in their eyes, Japan. And you can tell by the face, like they're stunned, they're shocked, they don't understand how this happened. But it was because Japan took a completely different path when faced with the prospect of European imperial power. So that's kind of the opposing views of, or the two different stories of imperialism in Asia. China attempting to resist the entire time without the benefit of military or industrial improvement. Japan, who grudgingly allows European and American involvement until such time as they're strong enough to kick them out. But throughout this whole story of European imperialism, you see the same goal pursued by the Europeans, this desire to get their hands on valuable trade commodities and raw materials throughout the Eastern world. The last thing to talk about before we wrap up are the different kinds of imperialism employed by the Europeans. There's a few different ways that they choose to control their colonies. And the two big categories are going to be direct and indirect rule. And those are more or less what they sound like. Direct rule is when the Europeans go to that country, live there, work there, and control that colony right there on the ground. And so that's what the colonies typically were. Colonies were ruled directly. So people from England would go to South Africa and rule directly. The French would leave France and go to their colonies in what today would be Vietnam or Laos or Cambodia and rule directly. The upside is it gives you much more control because you're right there. The downside is it usually creates a little bit more tension because nobody likes being taken over. Nobody likes being told what to do. by invaders. So the upside is it gives you more control, gives you more direct access to goods, but the downside is that it creates a whole lot more tension and frustration and resentment, and in some cases rebellion, that you have to constantly deal with. So in some cases, the Europeans, rather than dealing with that, would choose to rule indirectly. And so a protectorate was one example of that. The Europeans offer their protection, quote unquote, to local rulers. Maybe it's the benefit of European military technology, maybe it's the benefit of industrial advisors on ways that you could improve your economy. And so then in exchange, you would get a lot of the resources from those countries that you were looking for if you were British or French or German or whatever. And so here the upside is you don't have to have boots on the ground. You don't create the sort of tension and frustration that direct rule often causes. You may not be getting as much as you could if you ruled directly, but at the same time you're not having to deal with as many of the troubles and problems. And then finally, as we talked about with China, the idea of the sphere of influence, where it's even less about political control. It's certainly not, a colony where you're trying to take everything. A sphere of influence was simply an economic zone where you had exclusive trading rights, where you had exclusive development rights, where you had exclusive rights to the raw materials in that part of the country. But the rest of the country you really left alone because you didn't care about it. Because you were really only interested in the primary goods, resources, whatever, in a small section of the country. So if you were to use, the United States, maybe you only take Florida because you just love citrus fruit, or maybe you only take Texas because you just wanted the oil, and you leave the rest of the country alone to be run as the local government chooses to do it. And so again, the upside is it costs you a lot less because you're not trying to maintain or control a whole country. The downside is you lose out on the entire wealth of the whole country's resources, but it does give you access to specific targets or objects that you might have wanted. So that wraps up the chapter on imperialism. Again, it's worth going back through the PowerPoint or the website and clicking on some of the extra video links. The video on the Opium War in China is particularly good. I won't give the whole thing away, but there's something about flaming monkeys in there that might be worth your while. So hopefully this helped. Thanks for listening.